¿Qué pasa to the pack? It is Pack here. NBA 2K23 introduced the Eras system. Essentially, if you want to play My NBA Eras, they give you 3 separate eras that you can pick from. Those eras are the Kobe era of 2002, the Jordan era of 1991, and the Magic vs. Bird era of 1983. In today's video, I want to cover the eras that I think are missing. There's technically 5 that I'm going to cover, and what the names of those eras should be. I'm going to do all that in today's video. If you like that kind of content when it comes to NBA 2K23, My NBA, eras, simulation, rosters, all that kind of stuff, please join the pack and subscribe, and let's get it, man. The first eras is one that I necessarily don't think I really want or anything, is the 1950s. I was thinking of a name. I was thinking I'd call it the Mikan era. So the 1950s is essentially when the NBA officially starts and officially is formed and all that kind of stuff. The only reason I could imagine us wanting to have a 50s era is to do an entire NBA history simulation, and if you want to do that, you're gonna have to have 1950 on there. It's the only way that's possible. So that's essentially why I would really want this specific era or year, so that I could have a full simulation. Now, the reason why I'm calling it the Mikan era is basically one reason. He had the most NBA championships at the time of throughout the 1950s, and even though the MVP award didn't exist in the early 50s, he would have definitely won it most of those years. He would have been at least a 3-time MVP while also being a 3-time NBA champion. He kind of dominated the 50s. He was the first real star of the NBA on the Lakers. He was really damn good. I do think he would be the MVP. And then you could argue that Bob Pettit was the only other player in the later 50s. He did win an NBA championship, and he was a 2-time MVP with official MVP status. He was also very good. Those are the only 2 players that I think deserve to have the era named after them. If you look at the teams, you have a George Mikan team with Rudy LaRusso. The thing is, 2K doesn't have necessarily a lot of player rights yet, but they could absolutely get them if they really wanted to. Again, George Mikan's obviously the most important one, at 94 overall, great, the first great NBA center. You would absolutely want to use him. But the other team you could use is the Atlanta Hawks with Bob Pettit, Cliff Hagan, 2 really great players for a lot of years. You even have here all the way down from the mid 1950s, he was dominant. Cliff Hagan also in the early 50s, late 50s, he was also pretty damn good, averaging 25 for one of the seasons. I think those are 2 stars that absolutely would just be deserving of having a whole roster of them. You also have the Philadelphia 76ers, which I think they had a different name back then, but you have Dolph Schayes back in the early 50s, pretty consistent player, dropping 20 in his later 50s, a really good player for a really long time. Hal Greer in the early 50s existed. He was a pretty good player by then. Dick Barnett was playing in the early 50s. So you do have some players in the Warriors and the Lakers and the Hawks, and even the Celtics with Bob Cousy, who was the other star of the 50s. He only had 1 MVP award, and he only won 1 NBA championship in the 50s. So I guess you could maybe try to name him, but no one was bigger than George Mikan at the time. But Bob Cousy was very popular, to be fair. You had Bill Sharman, who was a bucket. I mean, it's not like there's nobodies back then. It's just that it's not really a popular time in the NBA because it was very new, and there was 8 teams at the time. It wasn't very popular. But obviously that all changes with the 1960s. Now, this era is probably the most the first popular era of the NBA. It's kind of what kickstarted the NBA's popularity. The 60s era is obviously what would be called the Bill Russell versus Wilt Chamberlain era. You could argue it should just be the Bill Russell era, but there's no denying Wilt Chamberlain was so popular that it has to be Bill Russell versus Wilt Chamberlain. In this time, Bill Russell had 4 MVPs and 9 NBA championships. Let me repeat that. He had 9 NBA championships in 10 years. And the year that he didn't win, he went to the NBA Finals. That's crazy. The only other player to win an NBA championship at the time was Wilt Chamberlain, who also had 4 MVPs just like Bill Russell, but had 1 NBA championship out of the 9, right? Now, 2K doesn't have the Wilt Chamberlain championship team yet, on 2K, but he was on the Warriors with Hal Greer. So they do have the rights to these players. If you look at the all-time 76ers, they do have Hal Greer right there as an 88 overall. And we know the Wilt Chamberlain's on this team as well. So they have the rights to the players. They could absolutely make the team. And then you have the Celtics with Casey Jones, Sam Jones, Tom Henson, Tom Sanders, Bill Russell. You have tons of talent on these teams. And even technically Bob Cousy on the roster as well. during the 60s time. Then you have the Lakers with Jerry West, Dick Barnett, Elgin Baylor, who was dropping buckets, Don Nelson, Rudy LaRusso. So again, it's not like there's nobody that they can make with these eras. Like, there's definitely a lot of players back then that they could make rosters off of. It's just that it's not too many. I know the Warriors technically had Will Chamberlain as well, but they also had Nate Thurman. I believe they had Paul Arizin for a little bit as well. So they do have players, they do have talent. It's just that, again, it's not as big and popular and so many names like the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, but it still has enough names and enough NBA championship teams to make a era's roster, in my personal opinion. If there's any specific reason I would want it, if I was making a start to an NBA, my NBA year, I would much rather do it in the 60s than the 50s. So even though I mentioned the 50s, I would much rather have a Russell Will Chamberlain era to start off in, personally. Then we have the 1970s era. The name for this era is almost impossible to make because I really don't know. It's kind of a complicated one. You could argue that it's Kareem's era. He had 5 MVPs in 10 years, and they also had 1 NBA championship with the Bucks. But you could also argue it's Dr. J's era. He was in the ABA at the time, but the ABA was pretty damn popular because Dr. J was in it. So he had 3 MVPs in that span and 2 ABA championships in that span. So he was just as popular as Kareem and was not just as successful, but pretty damn successful. The only other players I can imagine was Dave Cowens, who won 2 NBA championships with the Celtics in the 70s with an MVP, and Willis Reed, who won 2 NBA championships with an MVP as well. But realistically, it's going to be a Kareem and Dr. J era. And then there's a couple other teams in the NBA, like the Indiana Pacers, winning ABA championships with Mel Daniels, who was like, I think he won like 3 ABA championships. Freddie Lewis, Bob Netalicki. Plenty of players that were very, very popular and very successful that are forgotten about. You had the Milwaukee Bucks with Kareem, Oscar Robertson, Bob Bainbridge, Lucius Allen, tons of talent that obviously everyone will want to use. You have the Lakers with Jerry West, with Chamberlain, Gil Goodrich, that were winning NBA champion, that won an NBA championship. You have Billy Cunningham, Hal Greer, George McGinnis, Dolph Schayes. You have the NBA championship Knicks with Walt Frazier, Jerry Lucas, Willis Reed, Dave DeBusschere, Bill Bradley, tons of talent. So many teams. Like, this is already when the NBA was starting to really fill out, right? You already had many of household names like Walt Frazier or Clyde Frazier was really, really big. You had Willis Reed, who was really popular at the time. Dr. J entering the NBA with George McGinnis and Doug Collins, Henry Bibby. World be free. This team was stacked for years. So you have rosters of Kareem on the Bucks. You have Jerry West and Will Chamberlain on the Lakers. You have Walt Frazier on the Knicks. You have Dr. J already on the 76ers. And then, you know, the ABA teams you can add as well. Mel Daniels on the Pacers. You can add all these teams. There's so many players. I think the 70s, although it was a weird era because you had so many different teams that were good, like you had technically Bill Walton's Blazers that won a championship, the Supersonics winning championships. You had Barry on the Warriors winning championships. So it was obviously a weird time with so many different good teams. Wes Unseld. I think that makes it special because you didn't really know who's going to win the championship every year. There were so many good teams, so many good players. I think that's a perfect. I can't believe they added the 80s and not the 70s. I think they really should have added the 70s era. That's missing. And then you have the 2010s era, or I guess straight up the LeBron era. However, I do argue that it might be the LeBron and the Curry era, like the LeBron versus Curry era. Let me help you out. So LeBron James in the 2010s won 3 MVPs and 3 NBA championships. And more impressively, he made the NBA Finals 8 out of the 10 years of the 2010s. Curry won 2 MVPs and 3 NBA championships, and he also changed basketball forever. So you could definitely argue that it's just LeBron's era, but Curry was right there, really changing the game and being popular. You have so many good teams with the Iguodala 76ers, the Bogut Bucks, Derrick Rose's Bulls, Paul Pierce, Rondo, KG's Celtics, like the NBA champion team. Bill Russell was on the Clippers with CP3 at the time. Zach Randolph and Marc Gasol's Grizzlies. You have Joe Johnson's Hawks. LeBron James already in Miami. Amari Stoudemire with Melo's Knicks. Kobe Bryant was still winning NBA championships with Pau Gasol and Andrew Bynum. You have Dwight Howard on the Magic going to NBA Finals. You know, Dirk wins an NBA championship with Jason Terry. I mean, this is such an exciting time in the NBA with so many good teams at the time, so many players doing so many different things. Like the Spurs were an NBA championship like caliber level. I don't know why you wouldn't want to have a 2010s era. The 2000s is cool and all, and obviously everyone loved it. But the 2010s, I mean, this is the era that like a lot of us were watching growing up, or even like now. So we've seen so many historic moments. I think I would love a 2010s. And the final era, we don't necessarily have a like official name for the current era today of the 2020s. Right? As it's going so far, we've only had 3 years, technically 4 years now in the 2020s. It's been the Jokic versus Giannis era. Jokic has 3 MVPs probably after this year, which is insane, in already 4 seasons in the 2020s. So it's probably going to be named after Jokic, but championships are what people care about, and you could argue it's the Giannis era with 1 MVP already in the 2020s and an NBA championship. Listen, you could argue for either player. You could also argue maybe it's Embiid's, maybe, LeBron's won an NBA championship, so you could argue it's still LeBron's. There's a lot of different things you can do, or even Curry. But look, at the end of the day, I think the MVPs and the championships are what they want to name like players off of, and the only guy that's won an NBA championship and an MVP so far is Giannis. So I would argue it's the Giannis era, and I do argue he's probably the best player of this era so far. We're gonna have to wait and see. I think we'll really find out whose era it is in the next 2 years. But so far, as of I mean, for all we know, it's Wemby's era, and we're just waiting for it. But Giannis's era would be my guess. But Jokic has won so many MVPs that maybe it's also his. Let me know what you think this current era should be called. And if you like this kind of content, please join the pack and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.